Good Friday, the two thieves. The terrible concussion caused by the shock when the cross was let fall into the hole prepared for it drove the precious blood in rich streams from Jesus' thorn-crowned head, and from the wounds of his sacred feet and hands. The executioners now mounted ladders and loosened the cords with which they had bound the sacred body to the trunk of the cross, in order to prevent its tearing away from the nails when raised. The blood, whose circulation had been checked by the tightly bound cords and the horizontal position of the body, now with new force, owing to the loosening of the cords in the upright position, resumed its course. Jesus' torments were, in consequence, redoubled. For 7 minutes he hung in silence as if dead, sunk in an abyss of untold pain, and for some moments unbroken stillness reigned around the cross. Under the weight of the thorny crown, the sacred head had sunk upon the breast, and from its countless wounds the trickling blood had filled the eyes, the hair, the beard, and the mouth open, parched, and languishing. The sacred face, on account of the immense crown, could be uplifted only with unspeakable pain. The breast was widely distended and violently torn upward. The shoulders were hollow and frightfully stretched. The elbows and wrists, dislocated. And the blood was streaming down the arms from the now enlarged wounds of the hands. Below the contracted breast there was a deep hollow place, and the entire abdomen was sunken and collapsed, as if shrunken away from the frame. Like the arms, the loins and legs were most horribly disjointed. Jesus' limbs had been so violently distended, his muscles and the torn skin so pitifully stretched, that his bones could be counted one by one. The blood trickled down the cross from under the terrible nail that pierced his sacred feet. The whole of the sacred body was covered with wounds, red swellings and scars, with bruises and boils, blue, brown and yellow, and with bloody places from which the skin had been peeled. All these wounds had been reopened by the violent tension of the cords, and were again pouring forth red blood. Later the stream became whitish and watery, and the sacred body paler. When the crust fell off, the wounds looked like flesh drained of blood. In spite of its frightful disfigurement, our Lord's sacred body presented upon the cross an appearance at once noble and touching. Yes, the Son of God, the eternal sacrificing himself and time, was beautiful, holy, and pure in the shattered body of the dying paschal lamb laden with the sins of the whole human race. Mary's complexion was a beautiful bright olive tinged with red. And such, also, was that of her divine Son. By the journeys and fatigue of his later years, his cheeks below the eyes and the bridge of his nose were somewhat tanned. His chest, high and broad, was free from hair, unlike that of John the Baptist, which was like a skin quite covered with hair. Jesus had broad shoulders and strong, muscular arms. His thighs also were provided with powerful, well-marked sinews, and his knees were large and strong, like those of a man that had traveled much on foot and knelt long in prayer. His limbs were long, the muscles of the calves strongly developed by frequent journeying and climbing of mountains. His feet were very beautiful and perfect in form, though from walking barefoot over rough roads the soles were covered with great welts. His hands, too, were beautiful, his fingers long and tapering. Though not effeminate, they were not like those of a man accustomed to hard work. His neck was not short, though firm and muscular. His head was beautifully proportioned and not too large, his forehead high and frank, his whole face a pure and perfect oval. His hair, not exceedingly thick, and of a golden brown, was parted in the middle and fell in soft tresses down his neck. His beard, which was rather short, was pointed and parted on his chin. But now his hair was almost all torn off, and what was left was matted with blood. His body was wound upon wound, his breast was crushed and there was a cavity visible below it. His body had been stretched asunder, and the ribs appeared here and there through the torn skin. Over the projecting bones of the pelvis the sacred body was so stretched in length that it did not entirely cover the beam of the cross. The cross was somewhat rounded in the back, but flat in front, and hollowed out in the necessary places. The trunk was about as wide as it was thick. The several pieces of which the cross was formed were of different colored wood, some brown, some yellow, the trunk darker than the rest, like wood that had lain a long time in water. The crosses of the thieves were rougher. They stood on the edge of the little eminence, to the right and left of Jesus' cross, and far enough from it for a man to ride on horseback between them. They were somewhat turned toward each other, and not so high as the Lord's. The thieves looked up to Jesus, one praying, the other jeering, and Jesus said something down from his cross to Dismas. The aspect of the thieves on the cross was hideous, especially that of the one to the left, who was a ferocious, drunken reprobate. They hung there distorted, shattered, swollen, and bound fast with cords. Their faces were livid, their lips brown from drink and confined blood, their eyes red, swollen, and starting from their sockets. They yelled and shrieked under the pressure of the cords. Jesus cursed and reviled. The nails in the crosspiece forced their heads forward. They writhed convulsively, and in spite of the hard twisting around the wooden peg of the cords that bound their legs, one of them worked his foot up so that the bent knee stood out. Jesus mocked, his first word on the cross. After the crucifixion of the thieves and the distribution of the Lord's garments, the executioners gathered up their tools, addressed some mocking and insulting words to Jesus, and went their way. The Pharisees, still present, spurred up their horses, rode around the circle in front of Jesus, outraged him in many abusive words, and then rode off. The 100 Roman soldiers with their commander also descended the mount and left the neighborhood, for 50 others had come up to take their place. The captain of this new detachment was Abinadar, an Arab by birth, who was later on baptized at Ctesiphon. The subaltern officer was Cassius. He was a kind of petty agent of Pilate, and at a subsequent period he received the name of Longinus. 12 Pharisees, 12 Sadducees, 12 scribes, and some of the ancients likewise rode up the mount. Among the last named were those Jews that had in vain requested of Pilate another inscription for the title of the cross. They were furious, for Pilate would not allow them even to appear in his presence. They rode around the circle and drove away the Blessed Virgin, calling her a dissolute woman. John took her to the women who were standing back. Magdalene and Martha supported her in their arms. When the Pharisees and their companions, in making the rounds of the circle, came before Jesus, they wagged their heads contemptuously, saying, "Fie upon thee, liar! How dost thou destroy the temple, and buildest it again in 3 days? He always wanted to help others, and he cannot help himself. Art thou the Son of God? Then, come down from the cross. Is he the King of Israel? Then let him come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusted in God. Let him help him now." The soldiers, in like manner, mocked and said, "If thou art the King of the Jews, help thyself now." At the sight of the Redeemer's silently abandoning himself to the full of his immeasurable sufferings, the thief on the left exclaimed, "His demon has now deserted him." And a soldier stuck a sponge filled with vinegar on a stick and held it before Jesus' face. He appeared to suck a little of it. The mocking went on, and the soldier said, "If thou art the King of the Jews, help thyself." All this took place while the first detachment of soldiers was being relieved by that under Abinadar. And now Jesus, raising his head a little, exclaimed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And then he prayed in a low tone. Jesus cried out, "If thou art the Christ, help thyself in us." The mocking continued. Dismas, the thief on the right, was deeply touched at hearing Jesus pray for his enemies. When Mary heard the voice of her child, she could no longer be restrained, but pressed forward into the circle, followed by John, Salome, and Mary Cleophas. The captain of the guard did not prevent her. Dismas, the thief on the right, received by virtue of Jesus' prayer an interior enlightenment. When the Blessed Virgin came hurrying forward, he suddenly remembered that Jesus and his mother had helped him when a child. He raised his voice and cried in a clear and commanding tone, "How is it possible that ye can revile him when he's praying for you? He has kept silence and patience. He prays for you, and you outrage him. He is a prophet. He is our King. He is the Son of God." At this unexpected reproof out of the mouth of the murderer hanging there in misery, a tumult arose among the scoffers. They picked up stones to stone him on the cross. The centurion Abinadar, however, repulsed their attack, caused them to be dispersed, and restored order and quiet. The Blessed Virgin felt herself strengthened by that prayer of Jesus. Dismas was again crying to Jesus, "If thou be the Christ, help thyself in us." When Dismas thus addressed him, "Neither dost thou fear God, seeing thou art under the same condemnation. And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. But this man had done no evil. Oh, bethink thee of thy sins, and change thy sentiments." Thoroughly enlightened and touched, he then confessed his crime to Jesus, saying, "Lord, if thou dost condemn me, it will be just. But have mercy on me." Jesus replied, "Thou shalt experience my mercy." At these words Dismas received the grace of deep contrition, which he indulged for the next quarter of an hour. All the foregoing incidents took place, either simultaneously or one after the other, between 12 and half past, as indicated by the sun, and a few moments after the exaltation of the cross. A great change was rapidly taking place in the souls of most of the spectators, for even while the penitent thief was speaking, fearful signs were beheld in nature, and all present were filled with anxiety.